Hello, it's Anthony Campolo, and today we're going to discuss how data analytics can be used in the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and anti-corruption compliance. Now, help us better understand this scenario, I examined a podcast by the Alpha Sense Media Group who had Mr. Parth Chanda on their podcast to discuss how he uses data analytics for compliance, specifically with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. What I find interesting about Mr. Chanda is not only is he a CEO of a company that does this kind of work, that uses data analytics to help with compliance of laws, but interestingly enough, he's also a lawyer. And not only a lawyer, but he also was not only a defense attorney, but he also was in-house counsel for companies like Pfizer on how to better comply with these laws. So you kind of have a really unique perspective here of somebody not only who defended clients in the past, but also better advised companies on how to comply with such laws. Specifically, in a broad sense, he's talking about data analytics and how it relates to compliance, but specifically, he discusses how whistleblowing, the traditional forms of whistleblowing and sample-based examinations aren't really effective or as effective as he'd like in terms of understanding the compliance of companies with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and anti-corruption laws as well. So he offers a new tool. He offers a new measurement in terms of seeing if transactions are corrupt or fraudulent. And that metric and that measuring tool that he suggests is called a risk score. Now, specifically, a risk score is something that is used to evaluate each transaction, but it's made up of three separate data analytics. The first one is behavioral. So you're looking at the data analytics that relates to the behavior of the transaction itself. Is this in or out of the ordinary in terms of behavior, which I think is powerful. The second data analytic is statistical. Is this a statistically significant number in terms of the payment being made, for example? And then finally, the policy-based analytic, which looks at company policy. And the marriage and blend of these three data analytics, I think, is particularly powerful because it, especially as it relates to bribery payments, because it shows not only the number itself, but what the number means. Where is this number coming from? Who is this number being sent to? I mean, these are all the factors that are being taken in when you look at behavioral, statistical, and policy-based data analytics, which, as we'll discuss as we move forward, is very powerful as it relates to the corruption, anti-corruption compliance. Okay, so what better case to look at than Rolls-Royce as it relates to Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and this idea of risk score. So, as I mentioned, we have this risk score by Mr. Chanda, and how his analysis applies to the Rolls-Royce case. I argue that it applies in two ways. The first way is in terms of detecting the bribery and corruption itself. Okay, so by using a risk score, you are able to look at all the transactions that have transpired, and by looking at them and evaluating them on the risk score evaluation, you've slapped this number on them. When a number is particularly high for a risk, a company is able to detect and pluck in and say, oh, wait a minute, something's not right here. Is this something that is contributing to corruption or bribery? This allows a company or investigators to understand and detect the fraud itself. So in this way, we are able to better detect fraud in a more nuanced way than just a broad data analytic way, by blending, of course, the three data analytics that I mentioned earlier. So that's the first way I kind of saw, and I argue that, Mr. Chanda's analysis applies to Rolls-Royce. The second way was that he mentioned that around 90% of employees follow the bureaucratic procedure of a company. That implies that around 10% don't. And in that way, he kind of alludes to this point that, it's not the employees who are following bureaucracy that are most likely to commit corruption and bribery, it's usually around that 10% that do. Meaning that if you are willing to sidestep and circumvent company procedure and policy, what other procedures and policy are you willing to sidestep? And specifically, what do you really have to hide? Is there a reason why you're sidestepping company policy? Is it to hide something that you don't want the company to know, or it just isn't really ethical? And so in this way, I feel like companies can prevent the fraud. How so? Well, if you look at a group of employees and all their, actions and transactions, if you could see that a group of employees or a employee is not complying with company procedure, it's better off that you fire them for insubordination, for the lack of compliance to company policy. Because again, if they're willing to sidestep company policy, what other policies, what other laws are they willing to sidestep? And are they doing so for a reason? So by firing them before they can commit fraudulent actions, firing them for non-compliance of company policy, you prevent them from being able to further be incompliant and possibly commit fraudulent and corrupt bribery acts. So in these two ways, I feel like Mr. Chanda's analysis can help us detect and prevent fraud, and this certainly applies to Rolls-Royce and their corrupt case as well, where you're not only able to detect it before the media comes in and the external forces kind of pressure you to do an external investigation. I mean, managers, if you do the risk score, will be able to see that the bribery payments just aren't they just don't pass the test. There's something wrong about them. So in that way, they would have been detected earlier on before the public pressure. And as it relates to the prevention, if you fired the employees that were not in company compliance, you may have been able to prevent them from making fraudulent and briberous payments. Okay, so let's take a look at the fraud triangle and how it relates to Mr. Chanda's analysis. I think it's pretty powerful. Let's start with the perceived pressure. Now, if you implement the two items of Mr. Chanda's analysis that I mentioned, and to remind you, the first analysis is the risk score, and the second analysis is the firing of the employees who are out of compliance. If you implement those two things, you've shifted the pressure of an employee wanting or needing to meet a quota, instead, in shifting it to wanting to comply with the business policies, as well as acting in a way that doesn't give them a poor risk score. Okay, because if they can't get a good risk score, if they're not following company procedure, they've lost their job. So this idea, this pressure that creates fraud of wanting to meet a quota, of wanting to achieve a goal, gets, hamstrung and shifted, I should say, to, instead of meeting those quotas, instead of meeting those goals, to instead meeting compliance with company policy, as well as not receiving a poor risk score. So in that way, the pressure gets shifted from a pressure that creates fraud to a pressure that instills and inspires compliance. If you implement the two analyses of Mr. Chanda, you will eliminate the perceived opportunity, in that if I understand that my transactions are being watched on a risk score basis, I am not going to commit the fraud, because there's a fear that my risk score is going to increase by acting in a fraudulent or corrupt way, and as a result, I'll get fired. If I don't follow company policy, I'm going to be fired as well. So now this perceived opportunity just gets diminished, because there is no more opportunity if, by acting in a fraudulent way, my risk score is unfavorable, and I have to breach company policy to do so. The opportunity is gone, because I know I'm going to get fired if I do so. So in this way, both the pressure has been realigned and refocused, and the opportunity has been diminished. So now, where does that leave rationalization? Well, while these two analyses don't really impact rationalization that much, you need all three sides of the triangle for the triangle to be complete. And so when you've realized the pressure and you've gotten rid of the opportunity, the rationalization becomes irrelevant towards the fraud, and you no longer need to rationalize it because you don't have the ability to commit the fraud, and the pressure, which once was to meet the quotas, is now to meet compliance, does not allow you to commit the fraud anyway. So here, how would we use Tableau to help with this analysis of Mr. Chanda? Well, I argue that you could do it in two ways. The first way is by using a level of detail calculation that would create a chart based on the calculation of each transaction's risk score. I think this is powerful because it'll show managers, investigators, compliance officers exactly which transactions need to be looked at and which ones are, on the safe side. But I'd also like there to be a feature on the Tableau visualization where, after seeing the raw risk score, you're able to click into it and further examine what makes the risk score up. So what exactly, where is the behavioral piece, where is the statistical piece, and where is the policy piece? And so you're better able to understand it in that way once you could break it down and flesh it out into the three data analytics. The second way that I'd like to use Tableau is to use a live visual chart that updates as data comes in, that shows which employees are in compliance and out of compliance of company policy. I think this is very important for managers to understand, because as we saw in many of the Tableau assignments, many cash disbursements were authorized and sent out against company policy. When that happens, there needs to be an alert, there needs to be a control notification that allows the management executives to know that, something has just happened that is against company policy. Like, for example, when on the payroll, employees were being paid on the weekends, which is in violation of the company policy. Companies should understand that, managers should see that, and I think Tableau, by providing a chart and a live chart, will be able to help managers better understand that. And obviously, as it relates to Mr. Chanda's analysis, when this happens, the employee, if fired, can prevent them from committing further non-compliant acts, which could include bribery, corruption, and fraud. So, as it relates to a different case, as I was examining and looking at all of my colleagues' cases again, I kept going back to the Airbus case, because here is a case where we have a direct violation of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Again, we have executives paying massive amounts of money to foreign nationals for an unfair business advantage. In this way, if we used Mr. Chanda's risk score, we'd be able to identify that the transactions being sent out and made in furtherance of corruption, of bribery, would have been flagged, if not for the policy level, if not for the statistical level, definitely for the behavioral level of the risk score. And this way we could have detected it sooner. This case obviously differs from the Rolls-Royce case in the nature of how the corruption was found out. The Rolls-Royce case, what happened was there was a lot of public pressure that caused them to do their internal audit. With the Airbus case, you had such a robust employee base that they blew the whistle, they waved the red flag, and that sparked the audit. If you're using the risk score, you're able to identify that fraud sooner. So, course themes. Other than the massive themes of the fraud triangle, the Tableau application, the application of Rolls-Royce and Airbus, I specifically wanted to note how this, this podcast reminded me of the benchmarks auditors use in assessing fraud risks. There was a paper that we read back in Module 8 about that. In this way, the risk score is a sort of benchmark that auditors can use. And this mirrors that almost exactly. It's just a new benchmark. Now, how can we enhance this concept? Well, this benchmark that we have discussed, the risk score, is broken down into 3 separate data analytics. I think that enhances